what is up, y'all? Mental Muscle Coach here. And without further ado, I'm not going to keep you waiting a whole long time with some epic intro. This video is all about my experience with microdosing psilocybin. I'm going to be giving some background about it, my reasons for deciding to experiment with it, but also I'm going to be talking about primarily my own personal experiences, what it was like existentially when I was under the influence of it, and my takeaways now following that experience. Before I go into this, I've got to obviously give some disclaimers. That number one, this is not condoning or recommending the illegal use of, psilocybin, magic mushrooms, what have you, for recreation or anything like that. This isn't something that's a game. It's not something that should be played with. In my personal experience with it, I was doing this with, a very, very experienced energy healer, someone who utilizes herbs and plants for therapeutic purposes. I myself, even though I'm not coming up here trying to say that, oh, this was some, mental health experiment, I'm not giving you some bullshit. However, I am a mental health professional. So from this perspective, this isn't the type of thing you want to play with. Don't fuck around with it. But all right, let's get into it, y'all. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I'm kicking my feet up a little bit, getting a little bit more comfortable because we're going to have some fun with this. So let's hit it. First off, what is psilocybin? It's obviously the active, naturally occurring psychedelic compound in what we identify as magic mushrooms. It is the compound that breaks down, that metabolizes when ingested into psilocin, that is ultimately the truly psychoactive drug that, when it hits our system, that's really what causes those crazy effects, When it comes to the hallucinations, when it comes to, the shifts in perspective, whether it be, sensory shifts, like what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're hearing or thinking, what have you. All of these things are deriving from this psychoactive compound. So first off, why is it that I personally decided to take psilocybin? Well, for one, it's the type of thing where I wasn't looking for a recreational high. I wasn't saying, okay, let me go do some drug. I'm not, it's really not my mindset. What I was really thinking about is, after number one, understanding how much this has been utilized recently within the past, 10 to 20 years, where they've been able to utilize this to help people in therapeutic settings when it comes to, people with diseases like cancer, when it comes to people who are trying to, get rid of addiction, like smoking cessation. They've used this therapeutically to get some amazing results. And I'm going to be talking about that in a little bit. But this is also something where I really wanted to have the experience of ingesting psilocybin so that I could see how it would alter my perspective. One of the number one things that I'm constantly focused on, that I'm, marinating in my mind when it comes to my research, when it comes to my experiences as a psychologist dealing with clients, when it comes to the work that I do ultimately in getting my PhD and learning more and more about this stuff, what I'm constantly facing is the fact that our minds and our perspective are so incredibly biased and inaccurate. When we listen to people like Isaac Litsky, he's a very successful public speaker and businessman who talked about the fact that, oh, and by the way, he's blind. So this is the reason why he was talking about, sensory output. He was ultimately saying that when it comes to the electromagnetic spectrum, within it is the visible light spectrum. And that is the spectrum that encompasses, what we can see. He was saying that the visible light spectrum is 1/10 trillionth of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So in essence, of everything that we should be able to see within our world, within our universe electromagnetically, we're only able to see 1/10 trillionth of what's actually out there, which is absolutely insane. When we stop to think about the fact that our brain takes in 400 billion inputs of data per second, and because of the fact that we obviously can't take in all of that data, we have parts of our brain, like for example, the reticular activating system, which is designed to segment and focus our attention to not see everything, not see all 400 billion inputs, but see the things that are most relevant to us. So it's basically saying that we have parts of our brain that are designed to make us biased. Think about the fact that by the time we're 35, 95% of our thoughts, choices, behaviors, and emotions are ultimately conditioned. They're ultimately programmed. All of these things are saying that, hey, our perspective is biased and it is limited. And as long as we stay within our current perspective and our current way of engaging the world, then we cannot transcend it. We cannot go beyond it. We cannot be bigger than the limitations of our personality. It's for these reasons that I ultimately decided I wanted to experiment with psilocybin. So when I did this with a very, very good friend of mine, someone who I stated before is an energy healer who's well-versed in, plant treatments, therapy, things like that, but ultimately has a lot of experience with mushrooms. And so she chopped up and boiled the mushrooms, put it in like a tea, and we essentially drank it, the little chunks of mushroom, we drank it, put some green tea bags in there to flavor it, what have you. And we had this environment in my apartment where, played some very relaxing music, burned some sage, made sure that the environment and the energy was conducive to the type of state we wanted to experience. We didn't just want this to be some fun thing. We didn't want it to be rowdy. We wanted it to be calm, to be introspective, ultimately a pristine environment, to experience something new, for learning, for growth, for, transcendence even. Now, the thing that's interesting is I was expecting much more of a hallucinogenic effect. I figured my senses were gonna be altered. Like, the walls might start moving, stuff might start shrinking and shifting, if you will. But I noticed that it wasn't my senses that were really changing. It wasn't as much of a hallucinogenic effect. It was more so a shifting of my perspective. Like the way that I was thinking, the way that I was relating to my thoughts and emotions was really the foundational element of the way that the psilocybin affected me. Because when I felt it, it was first like a warming sensation, almost like a light pressure on my body. I can't explain it. It was like and I became more aware of the sensations in my body. My heart beating in the sense of I could feel my chest moving, my lungs, me breathing, exhaling and inhaling. I became more aware of that. And ultimately, I became more introspective almost innately, where I started observing myself, observing my thoughts. And here's the thing that was super interesting, where I was still thinking and I was still emoting, but the best way I can describe it is the need to think and the attachment to thinking for me decreased, where it became less relevant and it became, less me essentially, because you know how it is. When we hear that inner voice, we tend to mistake that voice for ourselves. We tend to attach to that inner voice, whereas I started to notice the more time that went by, I was observing the thoughts happening, but I didn't feel so attached to them. Here's the kicker. My emotions were still present just like my thoughts, but again, my relationship with them changed. And following that experience, my understanding of my emotions changed, because there's kind of two levels from where I perceive this, where it's like, number one, there's the experiential perspective where it's like, obviously emotions feel like, this energy that arises in us, and, some are good and some are shitty, oh, wow, I feel happy right now. And then it's like, oh, I'm angry. That's the experiential perspective. But on the other side, I know what, psychology says about emotions, that emotions are action indicators, that they're a means of communication between our subconscious mind and our conscious mind, But when I was in this state, when I was influenced by the psilocybin, I really came to more deeply understand that emotions truly are a means of communication. They're a means of intelligence even. Because when we think about thoughts, we think of thought and our ability to think. We typically identify that as intelligence. If someone can think really well, if they can say, very elaborate sentences, if they can answer questions that are conducive to very complex and effective thinking, we deem them to be intelligent. But it was like, in this space, I was definitely able to think at a very, proficient level. I mean, at least as proficient as I usually am. I don't know what that is. You would have to tell me, But it's like when it comes to thoughts, it was like, okay, I was still able to think. I was still able to function cognitively. But emotion became much more relevant to me. It became much more real in a sense, because I was feeling the things around me. Like when I was engaging with my really good friend, the energy healer, even before she spoke, I could feel energetically, I could feel her state. You know, it's almost like there was this deeper intuitive connection where I could feel her emotional state even before she spoke. It was just a vibe, like I got it, you know? I noticed that my own personal metrics for quality of experience changed. And I know that a lot of people may not get me on this, but there are a few who definitely will, and they're gonna find this really valuable. Where it's like, when it comes to our moment-to-moment experience, what are the things that we tend to identify as quality of life? You know, if I feel like, okay, I'm feeling decent in this moment. Number one, it's a level of understanding about what's going on, because that helps us feel like we have control. That's what helps us feel like we have safety. And so in order to feel like we understand shit, we need to feel like, okay, I've got a mental grasp of what's going on around me and what's going on within my particular life scenario. And so we ultimately see that understanding and cognitive knowing are typically the main metrics we use for defining our quality of life in a moment, because of the fact that we're so identified with our thinking. But in this space, I found that like thinking was so much less important to me, because I understood there that I was like, okay, thinking is something that I can do. It's something I can allow to happen, but thoughts aren't ultimately real until I give them my belief. But what is real right now is my emotions. Like, how do I feel? How does it feel to engage my very good friend right now? How does it feel to sit in the ambiance of my own apartment, you know? And emotion, as a result, became my means of intelligence, where instead of using thinking for everything, when it came to our conversation, I was basing it off of what felt right, what felt positive, what felt like a nice topic, what felt like a genuine, authentic thing for me to say that was a representation of the love I had for this person. You know, when it came to the way that I engaged my apartment, the things I did, it was all about feeling. And so as a result, I found that intuitively, the thoughts I was having became much more effective. I started to think about things that I've usually thought about in a completely different way. And I was like, whoa, this is causing a perspective shift. So it was undoubtedly an awesome experience. It was just awesome in a way that I didn't expect. It wasn't, you know, trippy or this sensory overload. No, it was very much a shifting within my relationship to my thoughts and emotions. And so following that experience, a couple takeaways, which is number one, I identify that was a perspective shift for me, but it wasn't like, oh, I saw something new. It was more so like, I now realize something about the world I've always been looking at, but I just engaged in a new way that felt so much more empowering, that felt so much more peaceful. And so I'm like, oh, I don't need to, you know, do mushrooms again to feel like, oh, let me get that experience back. No, it more so felt like, this is the way that I can engage life more often sober permanently. You know, it's gonna take some time to develop it through meditation, things like that. But ultimately, this is showing me something about life that I should be experiencing consistently. It's not giving me a dog bone that it's hanging for me to chase, and I can only get it by doing mushrooms. Is understand that the only reason we can have a physiological effect when it comes to any drug that we take, whether it be a psychedelic or anything, what have you, is because we already have a receptor for that drug within our bodies. So the fact that psilocybin can cause these, you know, these crazy effects, these psychoactive effects, ultimately, the only reason why it's happening is because we have a receptor for it. Which says to me that when we engage in meditation, when we engage in, you know, different brain states, you know, when we get into high gamma, things like that, we can have spiritual epic experiences that change our perspectives. We don't need these exogenous substances in order to achieve higher states of awareness. I mean, they have immense benefit when used properly and under correct supervision, you know, when it comes to therapy, when it comes to using it for mental health, things like that. It has very, very valuable use. However, it's important to understand that we don't need it to achieve higher states. It is simply a tool that is powerful powerful and available. Matter of fact, I recommend you to check out legendary psychopharmacologist Roland Griffiths. He's someone who's done some amazing work. He showed a particular study he was involved in that involved smoking cessation, and they essentially coupled cognitive behavioral therapy with assisted dosing of psilocybin. And they found at the 6-month mark following this treatment, at the 6-month mark, they had 80% abstinence rates. Are you kidding me? 80% cessation from smoking. Whereas when we find, you know, past studies, the ranges have been in the areas of like 30 to 40% when they just use, you know, typical therapeutic techniques, you know, like just CBT alone, things like that. This is powerful shit, man. And so, hey, I love you guys. Let me know what you think about this video. Like, share, spread the word. Peace.